Shard of Destiny, a fantasy novella by Jason Halstead. Publishing by Novel Concept Publishing, Copyright 2024. Chapter 1.
The manor house of Lord and Lady Prago was in the midst of what might be an impressive vineyard in a year or two. The grapevines were young, but looked healthy. That promised a wealthy future wine was certain to always be in demand. It did not mean the House of Prago was wealthy now, however. Coop's contacts had hinted that they made do on lines of credit and good nature from royals and merchants alike. Somehow, money always came in to cover the worst of the debts just in time. Rumors spoke of everything from distant business deals to lucky bets. Regardless, living like that could only last so long before the debts came due. Debts that could cripple a barely noble family on the outskirts of society. The lack of servants lent proof to that. Although with vines that weren't producing or even fully grown yet, perhaps that was why. Would a place such as this hire help only for harvest? Coop wasn't sure, but the lack of servants made it easier to slip along the scant rows of scaffolding and vines in the darkness toward the manor. Coop approached the manor from the side and spent several moments crouched and watching silently in the shadow of a grapevine post. Convinced there was no threat, Coop jogged across the short grass surrounding the house and tucked up against the wooden siding. A few moments there, to make sure nothing was amiss, and Coop moved around to the back corner and stopped at the nearest window. The shutters were latched, but Coop had a solution for that. A thin blade slid between the shutters, allowed the latch to be lifted. Another blade, this one short, dug into the edge of the shutter's frame enough to get purchase and pull it out. Coop let the latch fall free and slowly pulled the shutter out to keep it from scraping or squealing. There was no glass on the window, earning a silent thought to remember to leave an offering to Saint Dice, the saint of luck and gambling. The thought was gone a moment later. After all, what use would a saint have for a few coins? The room Coop had chosen was empty, save for a long rectangular table and enough chairs to seat 10 people. 4 more than Lord and Lady Prago had in their immediate family. They planned for visitors then. That also meant it was likely one of the 2 doors that led from the room went to a kitchen. Coop climbed through the window before pulling it shut and dropping to a knee to listen. Another minute passed and then 2 with only the sounds of an old house. No one was guarding the house or up late in need of a privy or a drink. Coop rose and moved through the room, stopping by the first door on the long wall of the room to confirm it led to a kitchen. The other door was where Coop needed to go. The second door led to a small foyer complete with closets for coats and boots. The door at the opposite end opened into the main hallway that ran through the manor. Stairs wound up and down on Coop's left, while to the right were other doors and the front entrance. Coop debated a moment, thinking and listening for any signs of discovery. When the house remained silent, save for the subtle background noises that meant people were lost to their dreams, Coop moved on and began checking the other doors on the opposite side of the hallway. The first was a small library and den, a fitting place for the lord of the manor to retire for cigars and brandy with guests. The next was a sitting room, outfitted for the lady of the house to spend her time dutifully sewing or having watered-down wine and tea with guests, while her husband was busy. The final room was an office, complete with a large wooden desk and a shuttered window that would look out upon the front porch. Coop smirked and moved into the office, searching thoroughly but quickly through the drawers, and then checking for loose floorboards or hidden panels behind paintings and under rugs. There was nothing amiss. No hidden treasure for Coop to discover. A pity, but it was just as well. Coop hadn't come to be a thief, or not a thief that would steal from the Pragos. Coop's thievery had a grander scope. Coop unlocked the shutter on the window and tested to make sure they would open. Once that was done, Coop went to the corner of the room beside the door and waited. The minutes ticked away while Coop went through step-by-step plans on how things would progress. Once that was done, They moved on to contingency plans. Coop was midway through re-examining all the known facts and possible rumors when the babe first cried. Coop smiled. Well past the middle of the night, but Lady Prago's son still wasn't sleeping through the night. The child still hungered, and that forced her to rise. Sure enough, the sounds of feet on the floor somewhere above meant it was feeding time. The footsteps paused for a moment and then started up again. The crying had a few brief pauses and then sounded quieter, but it was still there. Both sounds grew quieter, and then the crying stopped while the footsteps changed. They grew louder, and soon Coop could hear the shuffle of fabric against wood. Lady Prago was coming down the stairs, her baby silenced either by the act of being carried or because of something else. Lady Prago grew closer and closer until she was there, paused, and standing in the doorway. She mumbled something to the babe and then walked into the office. She circled the desk, sank into the chair with a tired sigh. She repositioned her infant son so that she held him clutched to her breast with one arm and used the other to open and drawer and pull out a flint striker, a small bowl, and finally a pinch of wood shavings and dried grass. Coop watched as the woman positioned the bell end of it over a small bowl. She struck the striker twice, launching sparks into the tinder and then catching it on fire. She set the striker down and with smooth, practiced movements tipped the end of a candle into the flickering flames and lit the wick on it. She used the candle to lit a second candle in the small candelabra and the desk and then fixed the first one into its base. Lady Prago placed the fitted top to the bowl from the drawer and starved the growing flames out. She put the striker and bowl back in the drawer and shut it before checking on her slurping son and then looked to the books on the desk. Lady Prago wore a sleeping gown that was pulled low to let her left breast free. Her son feasted on it, blocking any impropriety of her exposure. Her long brown hair fell behind her back so far that she almost sat on it. Her face, while tired, still had a touch of fullness from her pregnancy.
Ahem.
Lady Prago jerked her head up and looked to the doorway she'd closed behind her. Her eyes darted to the right to see Coop standing there, hood drawn. Her eyes narrowed at the dark colors of Coop's cloak and pants, as well as the shadows that hid Coop's face.
Are you here to rob me?
She asked, the tiredness gone from her eyes.
There's not much to take, I'm afraid. You've wasted your time.
I know.
Coop said. Lady Prago searched the darkness, hiding Coop's face.
Then what? Vengeance for some wrong done by me or mine?
No, I heard tell that you've been looking for something.
I look for a lot of things. You'll need to be more specific.
The Shard of Destiny.
Oh, that.
Are my sources correct?
Coop asked. She leaned forward and caused her son to stir. She adjusted so he could continue and asked,
Do you have it?
Not yet.
Lady Prago's smile was thin.
So confident where so many others have failed.
Failed to retrieve it, or failed to try.
Both, though I suppose more the latter. Cowardice seems common amongst treasure hunters.
I heard this was a family heirloom you wanted returned.
Distant family.
Still, you have some claim to it.
Lady Prago shrugged.
How do you hope that a boy like you can succeed where others have failed?
Coop's lips twisted in a smile in the shadows.
I'm not them, and they're not me.
I can't argue that.
Lady Prago said. Her son began to fuss, and she frowned as she looked down at him. She made some adjustments and shifted him around in her grip. She freed her other breast for him, and he latched onto it, sucking eagerly. Coop noted Lady Prago's turgid nipple as some leftover milk built on the tip of it. She covered it with her gown and turned her attention back to Coop.
You've pointed out I have nothing to offer. What do you hope to gain from aiding me?
Lady Prago asked.
I don't need anything right now.
Coop said. Lady Prago's eyes narrowed.
A favor, then, to be declared at some unknown time for some unknown amount. I should think I'll pass.
Not a favor, as such. Rather a relationship.
Lady Prago snorted a chuckle and looked down at her suckling child.
Look at how my current relationship has turned out.
Ah, right, I meant more of a business relationship. You need something out of the ordinary, you come to me first. Or if you know someone else that might need something special, or say something at a discounted price, then point them in my direction.
Big claims for someone so young, the woman of the house challenged. Coop's response was a question, not an answer.
Why do you think we're talking in the middle of the night in your husband's office, where I knew you'd be?
Her face tilted up a fraction of an inch, enough to let Coop know that she'd been caught off guard by the question. She took a deep breath and let it out. Her son rose and fell on her chest. Unnoticed by her, a small wet spot had formed over her left breast in her gown. Her son began to fuss and stretch. He even farted in her arms, earning a scowl and a wrinkle of her nose. She picked the boy up and moved him to her shoulder, where she began to gently pat his back until he belched. Only then did she cradle him and again and cover her right breast.
Bring it to me, with no one knowing anything about it, and we can discuss further how our relationship might benefit us both.
Coop nodded to hide a smile.
Give me a week, it will be done.
1 week.
She agreed.
If not, then I continue on as though we never talked.
Might as well.
Coop agreed.
Oh, and get a dog at least. Something to keep people from sneaking in and stealing anything that's not nailed down.
Chapter 2.
The Celestial Heights Cemetery was overgrown and dark. The low stone wall that surrounded the once hallowed grounds was crumbling. In some places, the rocks were still blackened by the intense fires that had been set loose almost 20 years past. Coop stared at the entryway, the black iron gate long fallen and rusting away. Not that a gate was needed. Even at their peak, the cobblestone wall had only been 4 feet tall. Reaching the cemetery had been nothing. Coop knew all there was to know about the place. A popular cemetery for the wealthy, it had been abandoned when the dead began to rise from their tombs. The solution had been to heave tinder soaked with oil onto the grounds and set fire to it and abandon it. Ever since, there had been nothing more to the place, though no one was brave enough to seek to reuse or reclaim it. Sadly, there was little to be known beyond that other than rumors and ghost stories. Coop muttered,
Ghost stories.
Ghost stories were told to frighten children and keep them in line. There was no such thing as ghosts. Or perhaps there were, given saints granted magical powers to their followers, and wizard could cast magical spells. Perhaps it wasn't beyond reason to think a ghost could exist, but Coop had never seen, heard, or known of someone that had a reliable story to back up any such claims. Long ago, when Coop was freshly born, there had been troubles in the world. The dead would rise, and in doing so, they would crave the taste of the living. That had been dealt with, though. Some heroes, somewhere, had fixed the problem. Coop never bothered to learn the full story. It was in the past. That's what mattered. These days, it seemed that the world was done with the dead bothering the living. So the rumors of chilling noises and dancing shadows in the scorched remains of the cemetery seemed like nothing more than the whispers of drunkards and madmen. That, or perhaps a carefully cultivated scare tactic to keep people away. Maybe there was something going on here, something designed to not be noticed by everyday people or guardsmen. Coop stepped through a crumbling break in the wall beside the gate. Twisting an ankle on rusting iron would be a bad way to start the quest. On cue, a cool breeze blew across the flat ground and made Coop's cloak flap in the breeze. A chill followed, earning a snort from Coop. Fire-scarred and cracked tombs filled the cemetery. Weeds grew along the edges, thrusting upwards in an eternal struggle with their brothers and sisters for the warmth of the sun. All life was savage and merciless, even the plants. Coop moved down the cracked and blackened flagstones that once made the pathway into the cemetery. Tombs passed by on either side, some intact and some with dark holes where doors had fallen, burned, or swung open many years past. Coop peered into enough tombs to note the darkness was shared in them. For all the weathering and damage they shared, not a one seemed to have a crack that let light in. For that matter, where had the sun gone? Coop looked up and squinted, only to note that gray clouds hid the sun. The wind was blowing darker clouds in. They seemed to throb and surge as they approached. Beneath them, the darkness deepened as a haze of rain began to fall.
That's not ominous at all.
Coop grumbled. A hiss escaped Coop's mouth, as a shadow seemed to dance off to the side. Coop turned, a knife appearing in hand from beneath their cloak. Eyes narrowed, Coop stepped around the tomb the shadow had disappeared behind. There was nothing there. The shadow, if it had been a shadow and not a trick light or a blowing weed, was gone. Coop turned back, disgusted at the thought that they'd let their nerves get to them. All the stories and half-cocked tales told from toothless old men about the dead terrorizing the living were just that, stories that happened a long time ago. Nonsense like that didn't happen, not anymore. Besides, modern thinking people knew better than to give in to such superstitions. The worst part now was Coop having to wade back through some clutching weeds with sharp edges to get back to the flagstone path. Weeds that hadn't seemed quite as obnoxious before when stalking the elusive imaginary shadow. A cold breeze blew through and snapped at Coop's cloak. Coop swallowed and trudged on down the pathway. Lady Prago's cousin's tomb was ahead. Getting into there and retrieving the shard was what mattered. Then, Coop would be done with the damned graveyard and all the silly stories. The first rainfall hit the ground with a constant patter that Coop barely had time to notice before it fell over them. The raindrops were large and hit with force, forcing Coop to tense instinctively. The water was cold too, but Coop's cloak kept the worst of it at bay. It wouldn't last long. The way it was coming down, it would leave Coop soaked in no time. Coop walked faster, legs stretching to cover the distance in between bushy growths and rain-slick broken flagstones. The tomb was close now, just past another belonging to the Miller family. Coop ducked around it and slid to a stop. Another of the damn shadows had just darted around the next corner of the Miller tomb. Coop was sure of it this time. Shielded from the worst of the driving rain by the tomb, Coop edged forward and then paused at the corner to take a breath. Holding it in, Coop looked around the corner and then jumped back and scrambled to find the knife tucked into a pocket on the inside of their cloak. Coop brandished the knife and waited for the snarling beast to charge. Rainwater chilled Coop's hand and made the knife's handle slippery. Several seconds passed, with no sight nor sound of the demonic-looking beast. It had been staring Coop right in the eyes too. Mouth dry and heart hammering, Coop crept forward and risked a quick glance around the corner. There it was, smooth-muscled body slick with rain. It was facing Coop too, although not as direct as Coop had feared.
What the?
Coop trailed off and stepped out from the corner of the tomb. The rain struck harder, driven by a gust of wind, and threatened to rip Coop's hood back. Squinting through the wetness, Coop saw that the beast was no beast at all. Or it was, but it was not a living threat. It was a statue.
Fuck me!
Coop breathed. A relieved laugh followed as Coop turned away. The Prago tomb was next. Just a few more. It was gone. The tomb with Lady Prago's ancestors was ruined beyond anything else in the cemetery. A few crumbled stone walls remained. The front corner seemed the strongest, but it only rose to Coop's thigh. Inside of it, the ground was missing. It had been dug out or fallen. Coop edged closer and watched the rain swirl in the emptiness where stone and ground should have been. Peering past the broken corner piece, Coop could see there was a bottom to the pit. A bottom with enough shapes in the cyclic mists to hint that the contents of the crypt were still there, just lower. Coop took another deep breath and fumbled under their cloak to open up the side their pack. Withdrawing a rope and then refastening the pack with slipper fingers was tricky, but Coop was up to the task. Coop fastened the rope around the remaining base of the tombs. Having survived for nearly 2 decades while the rest of the building did not, wasn't proof enough for the treasure hunter. Coop gave the rope several hard tugs to be sure. Pebbles and dirt fell into the sinkhole as Coop walked down the side of the hole. Coop had to twist to keep the rain from driving straight into their face, making the descent blind. 6 feet down, the muddy wall of the sinkhole crumbled and dropped, taking Coop's feet with it. Coop clenched tight and kept a grip on the rope. It pinched their arm where it was wound around it, but it took Coop a moment to realize that after struggling to catch their breath from crashing into the wall, the shadows returned, flitting by on either side of Coop's face. Tendrils of darkness that were like wisps in the wind teased the corners of Coop's vision. They were gone when Coop twisted back and forth to search for them, all the while panting to catch a breath. Coop refocused on the rope and ignored the dark shapes in the wind. With cramping fingers, Coop slowly loosened the grip of the rope and slid down into the shadowy darkness. Coop's boots at last scratched rock and dirt on the top of granite and stone. Shuffling around, Coop ducked into a corner and ignored the rain running down the walls. Rainwater blew in as Coop dug under their cloak and twisted to reach into their pack and find a small lantern. Lighting it took several minutes of bending over and shielding the striker from the wind and water. When it was at last lit and throwing out a feeble globe of light, Coop looked down first and noticed the rainwater was rising in the pit. Either there was no escape for it, or the drainage was so limited it was coming in faster than it could go out. That meant time mattered more than ever, and Coop had no idea where to start. Shining the lantern around nearly got it blown out. Coop had to shield it and move slowly, always protecting it from the elements that seemed hell-bent on victory. Half-buried bones stuck out of the ground. Digging into the mud around them yielded nothing but dirty fingernails and bruises. Coop moved on, struggling to open a cracked stone casket first, and then splashing through boot-high water to some more fallen caskets and battered chests. The wind howled in Coop's ears as it swirled in the pit. The water stung where it found skin. The noise of the falling rain was so loud Coop could hear nothing else. Until the roar of rain changed to a mix of higher-pitched strikes and lower-pitched thuds. The first of the hail began to fall into the sinkhole then, earning a yelp as a large piece struck the back of Coop's hand. The lantern fell, the small wick blown out by the wind and the shock of sudden movement. Coop cursed and bent over to reach for it, then stopped as the lantern swayed and shimmered. It was a small black lantern before, but now it looked different. Larger, with a proper shutter on it, and sinister. Coop blinked a few times, shook their head to clear it, and looked again. The old lantern was there, as it had always been. Coop looked up and around, uncertain, and spotted another up-ended coffin with the lid cracked just slightly open. Coop abandoned the lantern and climbed over a rusted, iron-bound chest to get to it. Once there, Coop worked their fingers into the crack and heaved against it. It budged, or was it Coop's imagination? Slippery boot against the wall for a second try. Coop heaved so hard the muscles in their shoulders felt like they might tear. Coop's shoulders protested at the abuse. Coop's fingers ached and then went numb and then began to slip. And then Coop went falling backwards as the rain softened mud around the bottom gave way and the lid fell free. Coop fell back hard on the chest with its rusted hinges and braces. The wood gave with a muffled, soggy crack. There was no time to thank the saints for their mercy, for there was little mercy to be found. The once elaborate stone lid to the coffin followed Coop to the ground and darkened more than Coop's vision when it crashed. Coop awoke coughing and retching. Dark shapes loomed overhead as Coop fumbled to sit up and get out of the rising water. Hail struck Coop's face and head, stinging and biting over and over. The pain brought a wave of rage that washed through Coop's mind and chased away the fog. The clarity helped Coop realize the lid to the coffin was pressing them into the muck. The water had risen several inches, enough to reach Coop's head. Coop tested their arms and feet. Everything worked, even if it hurt. They managed to wedge an arm and a knee under the lid and slide it to the side. 3 more pushes left Coop gasping for breath and coughing from the dirty water they'd nearly choked on. The lid slid along muddy rocks and debris into the water. Coop lurched up, stumbling and staggering in the slippery and uneven terrain. Upright at last, Coop looked around. The shadows that had gathered had retreated. Perhaps even gone, or were they still there, waiting at the edges of the pit? Hiding in cracks and gullies in the walls? Coop turned back and stared into the dark recesses of the now exposed coffin. There was something there, a shape in the shadows. Coop stepped forward and then glanced down at the dirt and debris that fell out of the coffin when the lid came free. Sitting partially buried in the mud was a handheld mirror. It was covered in grime, and the silver and gold frame was dirty and dented, but the silver glass inside was blacker than the shadows of the tomb. Coop stopped and stared, forgetting to breathe for a moment. This was it. This was the shard of destiny. Still holding their breath, Coop bent forward to reach for it. A sucking noise and the soft rip of wet clothing tearing was the only warning Coop had. A hand, so skeletal it was truly nothing but bones, snapped shut in the air. Coop's face had been a heartbeat before. Coop jumped back, staggered, and stared. 2 arms, one with a hand and the other ending in a sharpened stump of jagged forearm bone, waved from the coffin. They were attached to a skeleton that was struggling to emerge. A skull, its eye sockets empty and black, snapped its jaw shut over and over. It wasn't trying to talk, it was trying to bite.
No.
Coop said and took another step back. Their eyes fell on the mirror, the prize of their quest. It was right in front of the skeleton, just beyond its reach. But if Coop moved to get it, the skeleton could reach them.
This isn't possible.
Coop muttered.
You're supposed to be gone. Dead. Destroyed. Whatever. You shouldn't even exist.
Raving at the skeleton wasn't doing any good. It thrashed and struggled, trapped in the coffin by the muck that buried its lower half. Coop made a lunge for the mirror. The skeleton reached too, nearly catching them. Coop retreated and cursed.
This isn't happening. It can't be. I'm dreaming. No, this isn't a dream, it's a nightmare.
Coop hiccuped a laugh.
And talking to myself. I've gone mad then.
The skeleton's teeth clacked against each other.
Shut up.
Coop said.
Shut up. Shut up. Shut up.
The skeleton had no eyes, but it followed Coop with its head. It reached with its arms. It bit with its teeth.
How do I kill something that's already dead?
Coop wondered. The skeleton's arms waved, and Coop noticed the broken one.
Break you more. Smash you into bits that can't hurt me.
The skeleton didn't answer. It only reached out, mindlessly hungry for the warmth of life. Coop looked around and finally settled on a piece of the broken chest. It was a large chunk, about half of the lid of the chest and long enough to serve as a makeshift weapon. A battering ram in this case. Coop sucked in a breath and held the soggy weapon at the ready. Coop counted down and then rushed forward, nimbly stepping on the slippery ground and coming within range of the skeleton's flailing arms. The broken lid caught the jagged end of the skeleton's arm. The point dug in and made the clumsy weapon twist in Coop's grasp. Coop fell forward into the coffin with only the rotten wood of the lid to act as a barrier. The impromptu weapon did drive the skeleton's head back into the casket and twist its lower jaw so that it fell between them. The skeleton's other arm scratched at Coop and, through the cloak, pinched cruelly as it tried to rip cloth and flesh apart. Coop gasped at the pain and panicked at the sight of the skull so close. They grabbed at the jawless head and smashed it back into the coffin over and over. On the third strike, it crumpled apart in Coop's hands. The skeleton went slack. Its clutching arms not only dropped away, but they fell apart without the unwholesome magic to bind them. Coop staggered back, gasping and sobbing. They tripped on the mirror, of all things, and landed back on top of the broken chest on their butt. A fresh whirl of wind, rain and hail stole the moment away. Coop had beaten the undead terror, the thing that should not be, but the pit had an aura to it that no amount of hot baths would wash out. With their heart hammering, Coop wrested the mirror out of the mud and tucked it into a pocket inside their cloak. Coop turned to get away and stopped. There, in the ruins of the twice-smashed chest, there was a glitter in the darkness. Coop knelt down and sifted through the debris. A bejeweled comb with some small gemstones embedded in it was begging to be saved. There were some other items as well. A brooch, a necklace, and some earrings. The jewelry of a lady laid to rest with her instead of gifting it to her daughters, nieces, or other family members. Greedy, selfish bitch. Coop pocketed them all and then rose and looked around. The pit seemed darker somehow. The shadows were thicker and closer. Impossible, but so was a skeleton surviving, trapped in a coffin all these years. Coop's heart kicked up anew. It was past time be out of this accursed tomb. Coop splashed through the water that had risen to waist level. Coop swallowed nervously and then gagged at the memory of having this foul water in their mouth. Spitting zealously, Coop finally managed to gather their rope in hand again. They tugged at it, ensuring it was still solid, and lifted a foot from the water to the wall. Cold water poured out of the top of Coop's boot as soon as it was high enough to invert it. The climb up was long and exhausting. Each step was a challenge. Coop had to wrap the rope around their arms to keep it from sliding through numb fingers. The wall of the tomb crumbled and slipped under almost every plant of Coop's boots, causing lost progress with nearly every step. At long last, chest heaving and muscles aching beyond belief, Coop crawled over the edge and rolled onto the ground above the sinkhole. A keening wail from the wind as it swirled in the pit lent a burst of energy born of terror. Coop scrambled out and away and rushed on hands and knees until they managed to get to their feet. Each fleeing step through the graveyard conjured terrors that barked and leapt and clawed at Coop's heels. The statue of the beast, had it still been there when Coop had staggered past? Had its eyes been watching her? Perhaps even glowing in the dark of the storm? Coop tripped coming over the wall on the way out. They were too exhausted to catch themselves and landed hard. With a groan, Coop rolled over and then pulled themselves the rest of the way out of the cemetery. Another flop had Coop on hands and knees again. They crawled on all fours a dozen feet before Coop dared to look up and feel the setting sun's light. Coop froze. The setting sun? Sunlight? The sky above ranged from light in the west to dark blue in the east. There were clouds, but they were few and far between. The clouds were wispy and white, not dark, gray, and foreboding.
What the?
Coop trailed off and looked back at the graveyard. It sat there, crumbling and dilapidated amidst the clearing. Even the road looked as it had when Coop had first arrived, overgrown and little more than a forgotten path. The gate. Coop gasped and did a double take. The gate was on the ground, fallen and rusting. It wasn't firmly locked in its archway. There wasn't a dark, wispy, shadowy figure behind it with baleful red eyes glowing out of a pit of blackness.
I've gone mad like the rest of them.
Coop breathed. They checked for the recovered treasure and turned away. Coop took the mirror ore and studied the dirty silver frame and handle before looking into the depthless black surface that looked more like a hole into the abyss. Suppressing a shudder, Coop tucked it back into their cloak.
Fuck it, I'm alive. That'll do.
Chapter 3.
Lady and Lord Prego still didn't have a dog. Coop browsed the library for a few minutes on the return trip, long enough to be bored with trying to make sense of the books Lord Prago owned. It was hard to make out the anything in the dark, and even if there had been enough light, Coop hadn't bothered learning more than numbers and the bare minimum of reading and writing to get by in a world of shady business. The baby didn't cry this time, but Coop still heard Lady Prago's slippered feet as they crossed the floor and came down the stairs. Coop waited until Lady Prago passed the library on her way to the den before following. Lady Prago stood in the doorway to the office looking in. Coop smirked behind her and then was about to speak when they noticed the lady's nightgown was different this time. Before it had full, warm, and comforting. This time the nightgown seemed sleeker, finer, more expensive certainly. It left bare her legs below her knees, and the dip of the neck showed some of her back.
Still no dog.
Coop said after taking note of the change in wardrobe. A woman such as Lady Prago clearly intended to dress her best for the occasion. Lady Prago let loose a gasp and spun about. She glared at Coop's hooded form in the darkness and then straightened.
They give my husband the sniffles.
Facing her, Coop could see that the front of Lady Prago's nightgown matched the back. Lace trimming over a smooth fabric that probably cost as much as the baubles Coop had found in the tomb, if not more. The nightgown was designed to make a barmaid in her low-cut peasant blouse blush. Lady Prago's breasts, swollen with milk, did their best to try and escape the one-size-too-small gown.
You're not dead, that must mean something.
Lady Prago ventured. Coop smiled. Sans said,
I'm not.
Come, into the office, let me see it.
Lady Prago said, and moved to take her seat behind the desk. As before, she lit the candle and then, in her excitement, squashed the wick against the other one. The flame winked out, forcing her to relight it. Once the candlelight was properly ablaze, she leaned forward on the desk. Her voluptuous breasts sat on the top of the desk and bulged over the neckline of her gown.
Show it to me.
Coop tried not to show any appreciation for the irony of what Lady Prago was showing, even as she demanded to see more. Instead, Coop pulled a small sack from inside their cloak and untied it. From the sack, Coop pulled out the jewelry that had been cleaned and polished over the past few days, while Coop recovered. Last came the mirror, which Coop did not place on the table but held onto instead. Lady Prago gasped and reached for it. Coop held it back.
Our deal.
Lady Prago pulled her hand back and straightened.
Yes, of course. Keep the trinkets.
I intended to, but that's not what we discussed.
Lady Prago forced the irritated tightening of her face to relax.
First opportunity at special needs. Special deals and such.
That's right.
Lady Prago nodded.
If this is what you claim, then I will accept it.
Coop extended her arm and almost chuckled when Lady Prago greedily snatched it from her hands. The noblewoman studied it and turned it about in her hands before she held it up facing her. She whispered a word that Coop didn't understand and then couldn't even remember. Lady Prago gasped and then smiled. She smiled. Coop scooped the jewelry back into the sack and tucked it back in the inner pocket of the cloak.
Very well then, I'll be on my way.
I'd like to give you a greater reward, if you don't mind.
Coop paused.
I'm not one to turn down a gift, but a deal's a deal.
Lady Prago stood up and walked around the desk. She walked behind Coop and then leaned around the treasure hunter, acting almost as a big spoon to Coop's little spoon. Lady Prago held the mirror up in front of Coop and said,
Look into it.
It's black.
Coop said.
Hold it and watch.
Lady Prago whispered while she picked up Coop's hand with her free one and guided it to the mirror. Coop felt powerless to stop. Then Lady Prago said the mercurial word. Coop struggled to hold onto the word, but it slipped from their thoughts like water through splayed fingers. Even the fact that Lady Prago had spoken a magical word slipped from her mind as the blackness in the mirror swirled in front of her. The darkness took shape and form, parts of it brightening until an image came into focus. Coop was there, in the back of a warehouse, with barrels, crates, and sacks of what was no doubt ill-gotten gains. Coop was lying on the ground and clutching at a blood-stained tunic. 3 figures stood, knives in their hands. While Coop watched the scene in the mirror, a drop of blood fell from one of the daggers to splash on the ground. The image faded back to bottomless darkness before Coop could make any more sense of the vision displayed.
What?
This is the gift of the mirror of destiny.
Lady Prago said. She took the mirror as it slipped from Coop's nerveless fingers.
Did you see it too?
It is meant for the person holding it only.
Lady Prago said.
What you saw is your destiny if you continue to seek what you desire now and live your life towards your goals.
Aye.
Go, now.
Lady Prago said, as she released Coop from her intimate grasp.
This meeting is at an end.
Coop stood still, unnerved by what the mirror had shown. Lady Prago blew out the candles and slipped back through the doorway, leaving Coop alone. Coop swallowed at last and drew in a shuddering breath. If what the lady said was true, death awaited. Betrayal by friends, or at least acquaintances. Business partners? Whatever the case, the bloody knives promised a painful end. Coop walked out of the room and turned to the front door. They opened it, much as how Coop had left the time before, and walked out somewhat woodenly. The success of the night had been stolen. Even the valuable jewelry tucked safely away felt heavy and worthless.
You there.
Coop snapped out of their fog and saw a man approaching. He unhooded a lantern and caused Coop to squint at the sudden light. Other men hurried around the corner of the house and out of a barn and behind a parked coach. Coop was surrounded.
It's a bit too late to be leaving the house of a lord and lady looking as you do, the man said.
Coop got a better look at the badge the man wore. It was none other than Sheriff Hortimus, the man in charge of keeping order in the lands outside Larissa. A few coins to one of his men was enough to get them to look the other way. The sheriff was said to be above reproach. No matter of coins would satisfy him. For that matter, what was he doing there? With so many men, no less. The sheriff stayed to his offices most of the time, and only came out after hours for the most dire of circumstances. Coop turned to look back at the house. The window for Lord Prago's office, in particular. It was dark, but Coop sensed movement in it. The lady was watching, no doubt. The same lady that had set Coop up.
Sheriff, thank the saints you're about this terrible night.
Coop's stomach twisted. Lady Prago came rushing out the front door and stopped at the edge of her porch. She now wore a coat over her immodest nightgown, lending a pretense of propriety.
Sheriff, this man came into my house and threatened my very life. I was forced to give up valuable heirlooms to bargain for my life and that of my infant son.
The sheriff's hand dropped to his sword, while his men lifted crossbows that were loaded with bolts ready to fire.
On your knees, lad, while we sort this out.
He said to Coop. Coop glanced about again and, seeing no escape at hand, dropped to one knee and then both.
That's good, son. Now then, my lady, Lord Prago's not about.
He's in Larissa on business. No doubt this rogue knew of it and thought to ransack my house for easy pickings.
The lady lied. Coop didn't bother protesting. The word of a noble over a commoner? Or worse, in their eyes, a thief. Even when two men grabbed Coop's arms, they remained silent. The sheriff stepped closer while the guards patted Coop down and discovered the lump in the cloak. A moment later, the sack was out and the glittering treasures on display in a guard's hand for the sheriff to see. He grunted and said,
Return those to Lady Prago.
One guard turned away and brought them up to the grateful woman. The sheriff reached up and pulled Coop's hood back. He eyed Coop a moment and then shook his head.
Well, lad, off to jail with you for the night. We'll get you taken care of proper tomorrow. You look a bit underfed to work the sand pits, probably be sent to work the fields instead.
The guard still holding Coop cleared his throat and said,
Lord Sheriff?
What's that, robber?
Sir, begging your pardon, but I don't think this is a boy.
What?
Sheriff Hortimus asked. He lifted his lantern to get a better look at Coop's face. He squinted, trying to see past the smudges of dirt and faint freckles.
Can't rightly tell, strip him down.
Sir,
The guard said, and twisted Coop around to prevent Coop from protesting. A moment later, Coop's cloak was yanked off, and another guard stepped in to help. Coop struggled at last and cried out to try and speak, but the guards were efficient and brutal and were ripping Coop's ragged and old clothes as much as taking them off. Coop was knocked to the ground at one point, tripped when their pants bound up their ankles. Then, a hand under each arm, Coop was yanked back upright and held tight for everyone to see.
I'll be damned!
The sheriff said,
Had me fooled too. Furry as a rabbit down there, but no cock on you and not much for tits to speak of. Woman or no, a crime's a crime. You might be a good-looking lass under that dirt too, pity. All the same, I expect the magistrate will have you helping with the laundry to serve your time.
You're a girl.
Lady Prago gasped. She came down off the steps and walked around in front of the blushing prisoner. She stared at Coop's body and reached out to grab her small breasts. She pinched a thick nipple and earned a gasp from Coop. The cool night air and the abuse made it harden and stick out. Lady Prago shook her head and then stuck her hand down and felt through the blonde curls at Coop's crotch. She confirmed there was no cock or balls, only a cleft in the skin that led Coop's vagina. The lady pulled her hand back and held it out as though she'd touched something rotten. The sheriff provided a handkerchief for her that she wiped her hand on.
You saw me in my small clothes, you disgusting wretch.
Lady Prago spat at her. She spun to face the sheriff and said,
Sheriff, show this unwholesome thing no mercy.
The sheriff nodded.
Yes, my lady, we'll see to it she's set right for her offenses.
Get her out of my sight.
The lady said. Coop was jerked over toward a horse and dragged by the two men when she couldn't make her tangled feet walk fast enough. She was thrown over the back of a horse, naked save for her boots and the pants still wrapped around her ankles. She lifted her head and saw Lady Prago standing on the porch still. She couldn't be certain, but it looked like the woman had a satisfied look on her face. Lady Prago stiffened when she saw Coop staring at her. The noble woman's eyes went to the other guards and the sheriff before she looked back at Coop again. Her lips lifted then, just enough for Coop to be sure. Then she winked, turned, and walked inside. The door shut behind her. The sheriff called out, and the men spurred their horses on, taking Coop and themselves back to the gates of Larissa for what punishment awaited her.
The end. Thank you for listening to The Shard of Destiny. the first story in featuring Anna Kupra, or Coop as she prefers to be called. Special thanks to Ollie for editing and proofing. Be sure to like and subscribe and tell your friends, family, and random strangers in the street to come check out the channel and do the same.